Hello, everyone. Today we are taking a deep dive into the Washington Post story. Canada announces retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products as trade war deepens. If you saw our last breakdown on the U.S.-Canada deal collapse, this is the direct sequel, because Canada just answered back, and we are going to break down exactly how far this retaliation goes and what it means for your money. But before that, you are watching Decode Daily News, where we take the biggest business and finance stories and decode them so anyone can understand. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. So let us get into it. Here is where things stood 2 weeks ago, and here is what changed. Canada struck back at the United States on Tuesday, announcing new tariffs of up to 50% on hundreds of American goods. Now notice the word struck back, not just responded. That is not neutral diplomatic language. That is the language of retaliation. And it tells you Canada is not trying to de-escalate here. It is matching the tone the US set with its own tariffs. When both sides start using combative language publicly, that usually means neither one wants to be seen backing down first. And here is exactly how far that retaliation goes. Canada will double its tariffs on American steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. Now think about who actually pays that cost. Tariffs do not get paid by the country sending the goods. They get paid by the businesses and consumers buying them. So doubling steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% means Canadian companies buying American steel are about to see their costs jump significantly. And a lot of that gets passed down the chain eventually. And that was not even the biggest part of the announcement. It will impose tariffs ranging from 15% to 50% on about 700 other products. Sit with that number for a second. 700 products. This is not a symbolic gesture anymore. This is a broad-based economic response touching nearly every sector you can think of. When a government spreads tariffs across that many product categories, it is signaling this is not a short-term negotiating tactic, and that number covers a lot more than people realize, including fish, milk and food products, plywood, plastics, aluminum foil, appliances, agricultural equipment, motorcycles and electronics. Look at that list again. It is a sustained economic posture, and this list proves it. Food, construction materials, home appliances, farm equipment, and consumer electronics all show up here. That kind of spread means almost every corner of the Canadian economy touches something on this list, which maximizes pressure without depending on any single industry. And here is the moment that actually set all of this in motion. You're at war when you're attacked. And we got attacked. That is about as direct as a prime minister gets. This is not the language of trade policy. This is the language of conflict. When a head of government uses the word war in public about an ally, that framing shapes how his own citizens see every decision that follows, and it makes it politically much harder to walk anything back later. And he backed that language up immediately. We're going to hit back. Now notice how short and blunt that sentence is. There is no hedging in that statement, no diplomatic softening. That is a leader speaking directly to his own public, in the simplest terms possible, and simple direct language like that tends to lock a leader into following through. Because backing off after a promise like that carries a real political cost. Then 2 days later, officials filled in the details behind that promise. Counter tariffs are designed primarily to provide protection for Canadian industry impacted by US tariffs. Here is the part worth paying attention to. This is not framed as punishment. It is framed as protection for domestic industry. That distinction matters because it changes how this plays politically at home. And that protection framing goes both directions. And allow them to compete against US products in the Canadian market. Notice what that second half is really doing. It lets Canadian officials present these tariffs as defending workers rather than just escalating a fight, which makes the policy easier to sustain if this drags on for months. Meanwhile, Trump was not staying quiet either. Canada has been ripping off the USA for decades. Now that phrase alone tells you where this is headed. Ripping off is not the language of a trade dispute between allies. It is the language you would use to describe an adversary. And once that kind of framing enters the public conversation from the top. It becomes much harder for either government to present the other as a partner again anytime soon. And he did not stop there. They feel entitled, but they are not a state, and will be entitled no longer. That line is doing a lot of work if you read it closely. This directly echoes language from the original deal collapse, and repeating it now signals this is not a one-time comment. It is becoming a consistent talking point. When a leader repeats the same framing across multiple news cycles, that usually means it is intentional messaging, not an offhand remark. Then came the line that honestly surprised a lot of people, giving serious consideration to changing the name of Lake Ontario to Lake America. Now on its own, this sounds almost like a joke, but the context matters. Whether or not this ever actually happens, comments like this shift the entire tone of the relationship from economic disagreement to something closer to open mockery. And that kind of rhetoric tends to make it harder for negotiators on both sides to sit back down at a table with any real trust, and Trump was not done escalating on trade either. Threatened a new round of higher tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel to take effect January 1st. This is the detail that should matter most to anyone watching markets. Auto manufacturing is one of the most deeply integrated industries between these two countries. Parts often cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. A new round of tariffs specifically targeting that sector in January gives companies a hard deadline to plan around, and that kind of certainty, even bad certainty, tends to move investment decisions faster than vague threats do. Now here is some context that puts the size of this dispute in perspective. The U.S. tariffs had applied to just 5% of the $382 billion in Canadian goods that the U.S. imported last year. Let that percentage sink in for a second. Only single-digit percentages of the total trade relationship are actually affected here, which tells you this is not yet a full-blown collapse of trade between these two countries. And the number coming from the other side tells a similar story, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs impact around 6% of the $333 billion in U.S. goods exported to Canada. Put those two percentages side by side. Do not mistake a small percentage for a small impact, because tariffs like this get concentrated in specific industries and specific regions, and that is exactly where the pain shows up first. And one economist explained exactly where that pain lands. It's going to be felt. That short quote carries more weight than it looks like on paper. When someone who studies this professionally says it plainly like that, without hedging, it usually means the impact is not theoretical anymore. She made one more point that is easy to miss. Canada is a good market for U.S. producers. Now flip that thought around for a second. This dispute is not just about Canada losing access to American goods. It works both directions. American companies that export to Canada are about to feel this too, and that kind of two-way pain tends to build pressure on both governments to eventually find a way back to the table. And there is a contrarian argument in all of this that most coverage skipped past. The best way to think of tariffs is not country by country, but product by product. That's the American tradition. That framing is actually a pretty old argument, dressed up as something new. The idea here is that trade policy in the U.S. has historically been built around protecting specific industries, not punishing specific countries. Whether or not you agree with that approach, it explains a lot about why these disputes keep happening no matter which country is on the other side of the table. But maybe the most practical detail in this entire story is the one buried near the bottom. U.S. farmers rely on Canadian suppliers for nearly 80% of the potash fertilizer they use each year. Now this is the part that actually connects to your grocery bill. Potash is a core ingredient in fertilizer, and fertilizer costs flow directly into crop prices. If that supply chain gets disrupted even slightly, that is not an abstract economic statistic anymore. That shows up months later in food prices at the store, and most people watching this story will never even connect the two. So after everything, Carney summed up his position in one simple line: we cannot accept what they offered, and we will not give what they've asked. Now that line is basically a wall being drawn in real time. There is no wiggle room in a statement like that, no hint of compromise left on the table. when a leader closes a door that firmly in public. Walking it back later becomes politically expensive, which means this standoff is likely to hold for a while before either side moves first. So, that is exactly where my take comes in. But real quick before I give you my take, this video is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. So what strikes me most about this entire escalation is how fast it moved from tariffs to personal insults to threats about renaming a lake. That tells you this stopped being purely about trade numbers a while ago. And now it is also about two leaders who each feel like backing down would look weak to their own voters. For anyone watching sectors tied to steel, aluminum, agriculture, or auto manufacturing, the September 8th deadline is the date to actually watch, not today's headlines. That is when these tariffs take effect, and that is when the real cost starts showing up in earnings reports rather than press conferences. What is genuinely underreported here is the potash and energy angle. Everyone is talking about steel and cars, but fertilizer and hydropower dependency are the kind of quiet vulnerabilities that do not make headlines until prices actually move. And by then it is already too late to plan around it. So practically speaking, this is not just a Canada story anymore. It is a supply chain story for anyone invested in agriculture, energy, or heavy manufacturing on either side of this border. Watch September 8th closely, because that date will tell you whether this keeps escalating or whether both sides quietly find a way back to the table. All right, that is the breakdown for today. If this helped you actually understand what is happening, instead of just reading another confusing headline, hit like and subscribe if you are not already, because we break down stories exactly like this every single day. Here is my question for you in the comments. Do you think these tariffs actually take effect on September 8th as planned? Or do both sides find a last-minute deal before that deadline hits? Let me know what you think below.